My name is Floyd Harper, and for most of my life I have been very careful about what I remember out loud. That might sound like an odd way to begin a confession, but memory, real memory, isn't just something you keep. It's something you're allowed to keep. And back in 1968, when I was a forest ranger assigned to a stretch of land that didn't officially exist, I learned the difference the hard way. I've carried this for over half a century, not because I wanted to, because I was told to. The men who told me didn't threaten me outright. They didn't need to. They spoke in calm voices, used phrases like national interest and procedural necessity. They let the weight of authority do the rest. When they left, they took paperwork with them. Maps too. A whole sector of forest vanished from our files as if it had never been surveyed at all. But you can't erase a place from a man's head once he's walked it. In 1968, I was 34 years old. Vietnam was on every radio station. The Cold War hung in the air like a pressure system you couldn't see but felt in your bones. I worked out of a ranger station that smelled of oil, pine cleaner, and old coffee. We used paper maps folded so many times the creases were nearly translucent. Our radios crackled more than they spoke. Everything felt solid, knowable. Until it didn't. The sector they eventually told us not to talk about sat beyond a ridge line most hikers never reached. No trails marked it. No signs warned people away. Officially, it was just dense woodland with no points of interest. Unofficially, every ranger who'd been there came back quieter. We never called it anything official. No name meant no paper trail. Some of the older guys just referred to it as that stretch, like saying more might summon attention. At first, I thought it was superstition. Rangers are practical people, but we spend enough nights alone in the woods to develop habits that look like superstition from the outside. The first time I patrolled near that boundary, I didn't feel fear. I felt pressure, like the air had thickened without changing temperature. Sound carried strangely there. Birds went quiet in patches, then erupted all at once somewhere you couldn't quite locate. My boots sounded louder than they should have on dirt and pine needles. I logged it as atmospheric oddity. That entry never made it past the end of the month. Things escalated slowly, which is the most dangerous way anything can escalate. You normalize what you shouldn't. You adapt. You tell yourself there's an explanation you just haven't found yet. The radios were the first thing everyone noticed. We used standard analog units, heavy, reliable, the kind you could drop on a rock and still trust. Near the sector they didn't fail. They behaved. That's worse. We picked up transmissions that weren't on any assigned frequency. Breathing. Sometimes just static with rhythm to it. Once, a voice reading out numbers in a cadence that reminded me of prayer. Command told us it was signal bounce, atmospheric interference, solar activity. That explanation didn't account for the way the transmissions stopped the moment you stepped back over the ridge, like someone had flipped a switch. Then Ranger Thomas Ellery didn't come back from a routine patrol. Ellery wasn't green, 15 years in service, former Army, he knew the land. When he missed check-in by 15 minutes, nobody panicked. Radios cut out all the time in those valleys. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. When we found his truck, it was parked where it shouldn't have been. Nose angled toward trees, engine cold, keys still in the ignition. His logbook sat on the passenger seat, open to a page where he'd written a single line, trail alignment incorrect. That phrase stayed with me, still does. We followed his tracks until they stopped making sense. Boot prints that doubled back on themselves. Broken branches bent inward instead of snapped outward. At one point, the trail curved in a way that shouldn't have been possible unless the terrain itself had shifted. No drag marks, no signs of struggle. Just absence. By nightfall, men I'd never seen before arrived. They wore plain jackets. No insignia, no names offered. They asked for our notes, our maps, our recollections. They didn't write much down. Mostly they listened. Watched. One of them asked me how long I'd been stationed there. When I told him, he nodded and said, "Then you'll understand why this doesn't go any further." That was the first time I realized Ellery wasn't coming back. Not officially. Not ever. Over the next weeks, parts of our patrol area were quietly reassigned. Logbook pages disappeared. Radios were swapped out without explanation. We were told to stop filing reports about anomalies, told to avoid certain coordinates without being given a reason. And every night, when I lay awake in the ranger bunkhouse listening to the forest breathe, I had the same thought I was too afraid to say out loud. Something wasn't lost out there. Something was active. And it knew we were paying attention. After Ranger Ellery vanished, the forest didn't go quiet the way people expect tragedy to make a place feel. It did the opposite. It became attentive. That's the only word that fits. Not loud, not violent, just focused. Like something had realized we were finally taking it seriously. The men without insignia stayed for 3 days. They didn't set up tents or bring marked vehicles. They came and went in unremarkable sedans that left no tracks you could follow for long. Every conversation with them felt like an interview you didn't know you were failing. They never contradicted us, never corrected our assumptions. They simply let us talk until we said something we weren't supposed to. I learned quickly to choose my words carefully. They asked about Ellery's habits, his patrol routes, whether he'd ever mentioned feeling watched. I told them the truth. All of us did from time to time. That's the job. You spend enough hours alone in the woods, your instincts sharpen whether you want them to or not. One of the men, tall, gray-haired, voice flat as a desk, paused when I said that. "Did the feeling persist when you left the area?" he asked. "No," I said, "not usually." He made a small mark in his notebook and closed it. That was the end of that line of questioning. The search was officially called off on the 4th day. Weather concerns, they said, unsafe conditions. We all knew it was nonsense. The skies were clear. The ground was dry. But nobody argued. You don't argue when authority arrives without paperwork. You learn to read the situation and survive it. Ellery's name stopped appearing on the duty roster. His locker was cleared out by someone else. His truck was gone before the end of the week. It was as if the forest had swallowed him, and the system had agreed to look the other way. I tried to convince myself that was the end of it, that whatever had happened was contained, that the sector would remain avoided, unspoken, a scar you don't touch. Then the radio started calling names. Not broadcast names, not identifiers, just names. Spoken softly, half lost in static, always at night, always when you were alone. The first time it happened to me, I was on late patrol near the Boundary Ridge. The moon was thin, the kind that casts more shadow than light. My flashlight beam felt swallowed by the trees. When the radio crackled, I almost ignored it. Signal bleed was common after dark. Then I heard my own name. Floyd. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't loud. It sounded like someone speaking from another room. I froze. Protocol says you respond to your call sign, not your name. I reminded myself of that, forced myself to breathe. When I didn't answer, the radio went quiet again. I wrote it down when I returned to the station, or at least I thought I did. The next morning, the entry wasn't there. I started keeping a second logbook after that. Personal, hidden. I wrote in pencil so I could erase it quickly if needed. every strange transmission, every shift in terrain that didn't match the maps, every time the forest seemed to rearrange itself between patrols. Paths curved where they hadn't before. Landmarks drifted just enough to make you doubt your memory. Once, I found a fallen tree blocking a trail I'd walked 100 times, only to realize the rot pattern suggested it had been down for years. The forest wasn't changing fast. It was changing convincingly. Orders came down through unofficial channels. Avoid certain areas. Adjust patrol times. Do not engage with unidentified signals. Do not pursue auditory anomalies. That last one stuck with me. Auditory anomalies. That's what they called it when the forest whispered back. One evening I was summoned to the station office after hours. The gray-haired man was there again, alone this time. He asked me to sit, offered coffee I didn't drink. "You're a reliable ranger," he said. "You follow procedure." I didn't respond. Silence felt safer. "There are places in this country that serve purposes unrelated to recreation or conservation," he continued. "Sometimes those purposes overlap, sometimes they don't." I asked him if Ellery was part of one of those purposes. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he slid a folded map across the desk. It showed our patrol area, but with a section blacked out like an ink spill had eaten the paper. "You were never assigned here," he said, tapping the blacked-out section. "You were never briefed on it. You were never present when any incident occurred within it." I understood the implication. Understanding felt like swallowing something sharp. That night the forest crossed a line. I was heading back from patrol when the trees ahead of me began to move. Not sway, not rustle, but part slowly, deliberately, as if making room. My flashlight flickered. The radio grew warm against my hip. I didn't see a shape. I didn't hear footsteps. What I felt was alignment, like the woods were orienting themselves around a focal point I couldn't perceive. Then I heard Ellery's voice. Not screaming, not pleading, calm, conversational. "Trail's wrong, Floyd," it said from somewhere ahead of me. "You'll want to turn back." I turned back. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked, steady and fast, eyes fixed on the path, refusing to acknowledge the way the forest seemed reluctant to let me go. When I crossed the ridge, the pressure vanished. Sound returned to normal. The radio cooled. At the station, no one asked why I was pale. No one asked why I filed no report. 2 days later, I was reassigned. No explanation given, just a handshake and a reminder about confidentiality. I left the forest behind, but it never left me. Because whatever was using that sector, whatever could mimic voices, alter terrain, and draw men off trails, it wasn't finished. It was just patient. I didn't speak about it for a long time after they reassigned me. That was the unspoken agreement. I was moved to a different forest, a different state, a quieter post with fewer questions and shorter patrol routes. On paper, it looked like a promotion, better housing, better hours. In reality, it was exile wrapped in courtesy. At first, I thought distance would dull the memories, that if I stayed out of deep wilderness long enough, the feeling would fade. But memory doesn't obey geography, and whatever I brushed up against in 1968 didn't need proximity to remain present. It followed in subtler ways. I'd be filling out a routine logbook when my hand would pause, unsure why a particular word felt wrong. I'd catch myself adjusting patrol routes for no rational reason, avoiding clearings that looked too much like that sector. I stopped hiking off-duty, stopped camping altogether. I told people I'd seen enough forest to last a lifetime. The truth was simpler. I didn't trust paths anymore. Every few years, I'd hear rumors through old ranger channels. Another missing person near an unmarked boundary, a trail that didn't line up with its map, radios picking up transmissions no one could source. The locations changed. The language stayed the same. Always classified, always reassigned, always forgotten. I married, I aged, I retired. And still, sometimes at night, I'd wake up convinced the room had shifted while I slept, that the walls were a few inches closer than they should be, that the air had thickened, heavy with attention. I never heard Ellery's voice again. I don't know if that was mercy or design. What finally broke my silence wasn't guilt, it was pattern. In the late 1990s, I requested access to my old service records. Nothing sensitive, just dates, assignments, evaluations. Most of it came back as expected, but my 1968 file was thin, too thin. Months of service summarized in 2 paragraphs. No mention of the reassignment. No incident reports. No notes. It was as if that part of my life had been compressed into something easier to store. I realized then that classification isn't about secrecy. It's about containment. You don't erase events like that. You isolate them. You make sure they don't connect. That sector wasn't dangerous because of what happened there once. It was dangerous because of what could keep happening there, as long as no one acknowledged it. I've had decades to think about what we encountered. I don't believe it was a creature in the traditional sense. No teeth, no claws, no hunger that made sense. What it showed instead was awareness, familiarity, the ability to observe without being observed. It learned the forest the way we did, by using it. Trails weren't obstacles, they were tools. Voices weren't communication, they were lures. Confusion wasn't a side effect, it was the point. Ellery didn't wander off by accident. He followed something that made sense to him at the time, something that spoke his language, used his expectations against him. And I was almost next. The reason I'm speaking now is simple. I'm old. The people who told me to forget are older or gone. Whatever authority they represented has changed names, changed structures, but it hasn't changed intent. Silence is still the preferred outcome. But I've come to believe silence is exactly what that place requires to function. As long as people dismiss these incidents as coincidence or imagination, the pattern continues unbroken. Trails realign, rangers vanish, files get thinner, memory erodes. This isn't a warning to stay out of the woods. Forests aren't the enemy. They don't choose sides. This is a warning about the places that don't behave like places anymore. If you ever find yourself walking a trail that feels subtly wrong, not blocked, not dangerous, just misaligned, pay attention. If your radio calls your name instead of your call sign, don't answer. If a voice sounds familiar but the context isn't, trust the discomfort. And if someone in author ID tells you an area doesn't exist, but your instincts insist otherwise, understand this. Some landscapes aren't meant to be mapped. Some memories aren't meant to survive. And some things don't need to chase you. They only need you to follow. That is what I was ordered not to remember. And that is why I'm finally saying it out loud.